The Metaphysic of Poetry by John Middleton Murry. In a recent essay, Sir Henry Newbolt discussed the conceptions of time and eternity that have found expression in poetry, and in conclusion, with the aid of some rather difficult speculations by the late Dr. MacTaggart, tried to indicate a path of thought which he believed might lead some future poet to a more comfortable creed concerning these high subjects, and so to a more comforting achievement. The light of a new dawn glimmers, for Sir Henry Newbolt, in Dr. MacTaggart's contention that events in time take place in an order, a fixed and irrevocable order. But there is, in the mere form of time itself, nothing to determine what this order shall be. What, then, does determine the order of events in time, on the supposition that time is only an illusory way of regarding a timeless reality? The philosopher believes that there is good reason to hold that the order is determined by the adequacy with which the states represent the eternal reality, so that those states come next together which only vary infinitesimally in the degree of their adequacy. Dr. MacTaggart, according to Sir Henry Newbolt, held that he was justified in believing that the representations of reality presented to us in the time series are becoming more and more adequate, and will continue inevitably to do so until we reach the last stage in the series and enter upon the perfect vision which lies beyond time. An inspiring philosophic faith which, if a future poet were to embrace, surely his poetry would have the power to give, as only poetry can give, consolation and encouragement in the evils of the present. I doubt it, for many reasons. The simplest of them is that I cannot understand the theory. Perhaps, in the long practice of literary criticism, what little metaphysic wit I once possessed has worn away, but I can make nothing even of the primary notion that, though events in time take place in fixed and irrevocable order, there is, in the mere form of time itself, nothing to determine what this order shall be. What is this mere form of time that can be thus abstracted from events? The events in their order are our datum. The category or form of time is derived from our contemplation of them. Time without events, events without time, both are inconceivable. And since my earthbound wings refuse this first flight into the Empyrean, the subsequent speculation upon the growing adequacy of events in the time series to the eternal reality remains as remote from me, and as impotent to console me, did I need consolation, as the farthest of the fixed stars. Nor can I imagine that any poetry which accepted and proclaimed such a theory would have more potency over me. Not, at all events, in virtue of its theory. In virtue of the passion of mind with which the imaginary poet embraced it, perhaps. I am totally unmoved by the cosmology of Epicurus, deeply thrilled by the response it awakened in the mind of Lucretius, for there I find a secular passion of the human soul, to be freed from blind ancestral fears, uttered with a constrained intensity of emotion. And no doubt, if the imaginary poet were to find in Dr. MacTaggart's theory a deliverance from a spiritual bondage comparable to that once experienced by Lucretius, his pent-up soul might leap to a like magnificence of contemplative rapture. But it is impossible that he would bring much more comfort to his readers than Lucretius has brought to his. Yet Lucretius was passionately convinced that he was bringing a message of hope to his fellow mortals. His message leaves us cold. It is his ardor which kindles us. In other words, Sir Henry Newbolt appears to have involved himself in the old mistake that it is the philosophy of philosophical poetry that moves us. What moves us is the poetry, and though it is difficult to separate the poetry of a philosophical poet from the intellectual argument which gives it form, the fact that we can and do continually refuse the philosophy and accept the poetry points to the likelihood that the philosophy merely serves the same office in philosophical poetry as the plot or myth in other kinds. We give to the one as to the other that willing suspension of disbelief which constitutes poetic faith. If the poet is great enough to create, by means of his philosophy or his story, a significant order in the chaos of human experience, we ask no more from the philosophy. So much at least seems true of the philosophic poetry of the past. Whether philosophic poetry is likely to be written in the future depends, therefore, upon the possibility of a metaphysical theory giving to the intellectual and emotional nature of a poet a satisfaction comparable with that given to Lucretius by the theory of Epicurus, or Dante by Thomism. And that, I think, is improbable. In considering the question, we have to take into serious consideration the fact that we have no real philosophic poetry in English. Sometimes, it is true, Shelley is called a philosophical poet, sometimes Wordsworth, but in both cases by a manifest indulgence. Of the process of intellectual argument, they contain nothing. Each indeed possessed a certain metaphysical faith, but from the point of view of the logician it was irrationally held. Shelley's Platonism was certainly not the outcome of Plato's dialectic, and Wordsworth's pantheism was the product of immediate experience. They are philosophical only in the vaguest sense of the word, and it would be much nearer the mark to call them simply religious, as probably they would have been called had not orthodoxy in their day possessed a monopoly of the epithet. Of Coleridge, on the other hand, it might fairly be said that he did possess the capacity to write a true philosophic poem. He could think severely and sustainedly, and, what is of no less consequence, the processes of his own abstract thought were attended by real emotional responses. To his intellectual dialectic there was, so to speak, a constant emotional corollary. Yet, strikingly enough, he made no attempt at the philosophic poem which he so much desired to be written, and seemed so abundantly qualified to write. He contented himself with urging the much less appropriately gifted Wordsworth to the task. Why did he thus draw back? It is not enough to whisper the word laudanum. Only a few of the problems of Coleridge are explained by that easy word. It is more relevant to make clear to ourselves what Coleridge meant by a philosophical poem. In a remarkable letter to Wordsworth, he expounded his idea of what such a poem should be. Quote, I supposed you first to have meditated the faculties of man in the abstract, in their correspondence with his sphere of action, and first in feeling, touch, and taste, then in the eye, and last in the ear, to have laid a solid and immovable foundation for the edifice by removing the sandy sophisms of Locke and the mechanic dogmatists, and demonstrating that the senses were living growths and developments of the mind and spirit, in a much juster as well as higher sense than the mind can be said to be formed by the senses. Next I understood that you would take the human race in the concrete, have exploded the absurd notion of Pope's Essay on Man, Darwin, and all the countless believers even, strange to say, among Christians, of man's having progressed from an orangutan state, so contrary to all history, to all religion, nay, to all possibility, to have affirmed a fall, in some sense, as a fact, the possibility of which cannot be understood from the nature of the will, but the reality of which is attested by experience and conscience. Fallen men contemplated in the different ages of the world and in the different states, savage, barbarous, civilized, the lonely cot or borderer's wigwam, the village, the manufacturing town, seaport, city, universities, and, not disguising the sore evils under which the whole creation groans, to point out, however, a manifest scheme of redemption, of reconciliation with this enmity with nature. What are the obstacles, the Antichrist that must be and already is, and to conclude by a grand didactic swell on the necessary identity of a true philosophy with a true religion, agreeing in the results and differing only as the analytic and synthetic process, as discursive from intuitive, the former chiefly useful in perfecting the latter. In short, the necessity for a general evolution in the modes of developing and disciplining the human mind by the substitution of life and intelligence, considered in its different powers from the plant up to that state in which the difference of degree becomes a new kind. Man, self-consciousness, but yet not by essential opposition, for the philosophy of mechanism, which, in everything that is most worthy of the human intellect, strikes death, and cheats itself by mistaking clear images for distinct conceptions, and which idly demands conceptions where intuitions alone are possible or adequate to the majesty of truth. In short, facts elevated into theory, theory into laws, and laws into living and intelligent powers. True idealism necessarily perfecting itself in realism, realism refining itself into idealism." Unquote. If we set aside the initial demonstration of the absurdity of the sensationalist psychology which Coleridge demands, we see that the rest of the contemplated poem deals with man in the concrete. The philosophical phases are simple. First, a fall, in some sense, would be affirmed on the evidence of experience and conscience. Second, the way would be pointed to a manifest scheme of redemption, which significantly is equivalent to a reconciliation with this enmity with nature. And third, nothing less than a revolution in philosophy itself is to be proclaimed. Intuitions alone are adequate to the majesty of truth. In order fully to grasp Coleridge's intention, we need the aid of other passages in his writings. His conception of the fall, in some sense, is illuminated by his words in an appendix to Lay Sermons. The soul, regarding nature, seems to say to herself, "From this state hast thou fallen. Such shouldst thou still become, thyself all permeable to a higher power." And again, what the plant is, by an act not its own, and unconsciously, that thou must make thyself to become. The manifest scheme of redemption thus consists in the conscious achievement of a condition of pure spontaneity, in which state man should be so completely obedient to and expressive of life as the rest of organic nature appears to be. We may suppose that this belief, which recalls certain of the authentic sayings of Jesus, was reached by experience and intuition, and that it is itself an example of that superiority of intuition to conception which the whole poem was to establish. This process of intuition, applied to living nature, is what Coleridge calls reason, and, like Goethe, resolutely distinguishes from understanding. Indeed, Goethe's words to Eckermann provide the aptest commentary on Coleridge's thought. The Godhead is effective in the living and not in the dead, in the becoming and changing, not in the become and set fast. And therefore, similarly, the reason is concerned only to strive towards the divine through the becoming and the living, and the understanding only to make use of the become and the set fast. Finally, with the identification of realism and idealism with which Coleridge's letter closes, we may compare his conviction that nature is a symbol of the ideas of reason established in the truth of things, and that a symbol is consubstantial with the truth of which it is the conductor. So, the language of nature is a subordinate logos that was in the beginning, and was with the thing it represented, and was the thing it represented. Thus we may describe the theme of Coleridge's philosophic poem as the supersession of ratiocination, by intuition, of understanding, by reason. This process, achieved in the individual man, was redemption. By it man became one with nature, for the spark of intuitive reason is kindled in him by a contemplation of nature. The conflict of emotion and thought within himself is resolved, and his consciousness becomes, as it were, organically whole. Thus reintegrated, consciousness has an immediate apprehension of truth, which is not abstract or ideal, but concrete and real. Nature is the truth, and as man, by the attainment of reason in himself, is reconciled with nature, so he himself becomes part of the truth, all permeable to a higher power. The doctrine may seem difficult, or at least difficult to distinguish from a sort of Rousseauism. With Rousseauism it has little in common, though it has affinities to Rousseau. But it is, certain nuances of terminology apart, almost exactly identical with Goethe's philosophy. It is again very intimately connected with Keats's quite independent thinking, as will be apparent to anyone who studies, with the care which it demands, Keats's famous letter on the veil of soul-making. But the point for immediate emphasis is that this philosophy of Coleridge's is, like the related philosophies of Goethe and Keats, the philosophy of a poet. That is not to say it is inferior to the philosophy of a philosopher. I myself am convinced of the contrary. But it is profoundly different. For the true poet, the man gifted with more than ordinary organic sensibility, starts with an ineradicable faith in intuition. The faith may be unconscious, and very often it is never brought into the full light of consciousness. But the faith is there. The poet cannot help believing in intuition. He has it, and he is a poet because he has it. But all these three men, Coleridge, Goethe, and Keats, possessed besides their native poetic gift very great intellectual power, by which they were enabled to make the workings of their own mind distinct to themselves and to contemplate the nature of that intuitive faculty which was their birthright. Essentially, their philosophies are a reasoned justification of their own poetic processes of mind. Abstract conceptual thinking seemed to them always a rather clumsy substitute for a finer means of attaining truth of which they had actual experience. Inevitably, there must, to the philosopher, appear to be something paradoxical, if not wholly intangible, in this philosophy of poets, and that is the reason why the thinking of these three great men, even of Goethe, has never received any serious attention from professional philosophers. To follow their arguments, a certain capacity for the sideways glance is required, for here are men who, though certainly not inferior to the average philosopher in the faculty of discursive thinking, possessed another gift besides, to which they attached infinitely more importance, and which had, and was bound to have, a very potent influence on their abstract thinking. Though capable of abstract thinking, they were unable to believe in it as an instrument for attaining truth, for the simple reason that the divorce between the abstract and the concrete from which discourse takes its rise was overcome by their own peculiar faculty of intuition. The distinction between universal and particular could never be to them a distinction of the real, but only a distinction, and to them, in their highest moments, an unnecessary one, imposed upon the real. For them the particular was the universal, the real was the ideal. The identification may be disconcerting to the philosopher. but he ought to reckon with the fact that there is a kind of mind, and a very powerful kind of mind, to which that identification is necessary and inevitable, the beginning and the end of thinking. One may get a pretty clear glimpse of the process of poetic thinking by reading Goethe's account of his reconciliation with Schiller, who had been deeply influenced by Kantian idealism. The dispute between the two men, did Goethe's drawing of a typical plant represent an idea or an experience, touched the center of the problem. The dispute, it is true, was a dispute between two poets, but in reality it was a dispute between the purest type of poetic mind, with a reasoned and justified awareness of its own peculiar powers, and one less pure. Schiller combined, and in this he was very like Shelley, an impulsive but very genuine poetic fluency with an acquired philosophy. There was a liaison of discordant elements. Goethe, on the contrary, was totus teres atque rotundus, and probably it was Schiller he had in mind when he wrote, "There is a great difference between a poet who seeks the particular for the sake of the universal, and one who seeks the universal in the particular. The former method breeds allegory, where the particular is used only as an example, an instance of the universal, but the latter is the true method of poetry. It expresses a particular without a thought of or a reference to the universal. But whoever has a living grasp of this particular grasps the universal with it, knowing it either not at all or only long afterwards." It reminds one very distinctly of the letter Keats wrote to Shelley in August 1820 in acknowledgment of a copy of the Cenci. "There is only one part of it I can judge of, the poetry and dramatic effect, which by many spirits nowadays is considered the mammon. A modern work, it is said, must have a purpose, which may be the god. An artist must serve mammon. He must have self-concentration. Selfishness, perhaps. You, I am sure, will forgive me for sincerely remarking that you might curb your magnanimity and be more of an artist and load every rift of your subject with ore." One further sentence from Goethe's letters to Schiller will make clear the relation of thought between the two statements. The non-poet, just as much as the poet, can be moved by a poetical idea, but he cannot transfer it into an object. He cannot express it with a claim to inevitability. The power, the universality of poetry lies in its concreteness. The true poet's unremitting insistence upon particularity, which seems to the uncomprehending eye the service of mammon, is, to the discerning vision, his own peculiar and inimitable service to God, to that subordinate logos of nature, to repeat Coleridge's characteristic phrase, which was with the thing it represented, and was the thing it represented. Of course, it is evident that the most abstract and apparently logical of these statements is largely metaphorical. When Goethe insists that the true poet expresses a particular, and that whoever grasps this particular grasps the universal also with it, he is not speaking of the same universals and particulars as the logician. The man who grasps the particular person delineated by a dramatic poet, or the particular emotion expressed by a lyrical poet, cannot be said in either case to comprehend a logical universal. Something other than a concept is grasped, and another faculty than conceptual thinking is at work. The universals of poetry are not concepts, nor have they conceptual equivalents. Goethe was perfectly clear about that. What he was really saying is that in the true poetic activity of mind, the logical distinction between particulars and universals is ignored, because it is invalid for that activity of mind. In poetry, qua poetry, there are neither particulars or universals, abstracts or concretes. That is to say that in the very method of poetry a metaphysic is implicit. This was the metaphysic which Coleridge wished Wordsworth to make explicit in his great philosophical poem, the scheme of which he outlined in his letter. Yet Wordsworth did not write it, and Coleridge himself made no attempt. What was the reason for the failure? We must remember that Wordsworth did make a beginning, and that Coleridge was once enthusiastic over it. It was the prelude. We may suppose, then, that Coleridge believed this was the right way to begin, namely with an account of the growth of the poet's mind. The poet would then show how the faculty of poetic thought came to be what it was, and how intuition, unconsciously active from childhood, came consciously to claim for itself the supreme position in the poet's mind. This was possible. This, to a considerable extent, Wordsworth actually did. But what then? Was not something very like a paradox imminent? For if the poet was indeed the person he claimed to be, who by his intuition apprehended the truth, manifest where alone it could be manifest, in the infinite particularity of the universe, why trouble to explain what must, in the nature of the case, be either self-evident or not evident at all? why not simply pursue his own natural task of making poetry in which the universality of the particular, the ideality of the real, should be made plain to those capable of seeing? What indeed was the purpose of a specifically philosophic poem, seeing that all true poetry, all poetry written according to Goethe's true poetic method, contained, implicit in itself, a philosophy superior to all others? And finally, how could such a philosophical poem be written, seeing that this true philosophy, proceeding from particular, to intuition, from intuition, was, by hypothesis, incapable of being fully explained in anything but non-philosophical poetry? Whether or not Coleridge ever presented this difficulty to himself in direct connection with his demand for a philosophical poem, that he recognized it clearly enough in other contexts is evident from the nature of his praise of Shakespeare, whom he holds up constantly and with unvarying conviction, and not in a figurative sense, as the supreme philosopher. In fact, Coleridge's position, stated in the simplest terms, was that the purest poetry was the purest philosophy. He had infinite difficulty in stating this in an intelligible form, because by definition a philosophy which proceeds from intuition to intuition is incapable of being apprehended save by intuition. And he was, moreover, involved in the impossible task of trying to find a conceptual language for processes of mind which were not conceptual at all. For this reason he has been, naturally but quite unwarrantably, accused of confusing poetic with conceptual thought in his criticism. He knew perfectly well, no man better, the difference between intuitive and discursive thinking, but he was compelled by the nature of his attempt continually to have recourse to clumsy intellectual equivalents for his intuitive processes. Thus, when he describes Shakespeare's method as the observation of a mind, which having formed a theory and a system upon its own nature, remarks all things that are examples of its truth, and above all enabling it to convey the truths of philosophy, as mere effects derived from what we may call the outward watchings of life, the theory, the system, the philosophy of which he speaks, are not at all what the ordinary dialectician would understand by such words. Coleridge is trying to find utterance for a thought which haunted him. We might gather a dozen other efforts to declare it. One shall suffice. It was Shakespeare's prerogative to have the universal, which is potentially in each particular, opened out to him, the homo generalis, not as an abstraction from observation of a variety of men, but as the substance capable of endless modifications. The power which Coleridge is attributing to Shakespeare is precisely the same as that which Goethe also made frequent efforts to distinguish, the anschauliche Urteilskraft, the exakte sinnliche Fantasie, the power precisely of seeing the universal in the particular, of penetrating by intuition and self-knowledge into the creative force which is and is recognized in its differentiations. The same inherent difficulty of language which has led to Coleridge's thinking being dismissed as transcendental and mystical must inevitably have recurred in an avowedly philosophic poem. It would have been well enough if Coleridge's mind had been inflamed by an alien system of philosophy, but that was impossible. He was a poet with the poetic experience. The only philosophy that could satisfy him was the philosophy which set poetry in the supreme position which, he was intellectually convinced, it rightly occupied. The only way to express that philosophy was to practice it, and the only way to practice it was to be simply a creative poet. It may be said that Coleridge's failure was the failure of a particular man, and that we must not draw a general conclusion from it. The objection is only plausible if we are prepared to challenge the truth of Coleridge's thought upon the nature of poetry. This, I think, is only possible to those who do not understand it. Therefore, Coleridge's failure, and Wordsworth's, is really prophetic of the failure of all serious philosophical poetry in future. The attempt will be possible only to a poet who is less a poet and less a philosopher than he ought to be. It is condemned beforehand to second-rateness. Philosophical poetry can never again be great with the greatness of Lucretius or Dante, because whenever a poet appears with a comparable poetic gift and a comparable depth and energy of thought, his intellectual power will be applied, as the intellectual power of Coleridge and Goethe and Keats was applied, to the justification of his own specifically poetic processes of mind. The essential condition of philosophical poetry is that the poet should believe that there is a faculty of mind superior to the poetic. That was possible for Dante, tremendous poet though he was, but since Shakespeare lived and wrote, it is not possible. Shakespeare created a new order of values, independent of the great medieval Christian tradition, yet spiritual through and through. a system of values, so far as we can see, completely divorced from any faith in immortality or after justice, compatible indeed with a real agnosticism, yet in the height and breadth of the word, profoundly religious. This system of values, which seems to us to have been produced like a creation of nature, makes a deep and undiminished appeal to us. Generation after generation of men have meditated upon it, only to discover that this system of values is not a system at all. It satisfies, yet it cannot be analyzed. The order is there, but it is the inscrutable order of organic life. And this extraordinary thinking was produced by the poetic spirit, working free and autonomous, by a poet who trusted, as no poet had done before, or has done since, his own poetic genius. The poets who, since Shakespeare, have been capable of philosophic poetry have had Shakespeare before them to show them what philosophic poetry can be. Perhaps, without his works before them, Goethe and Coleridge and Keats might not have reached the conclusions and certainties they did reach. Certainly, no poets have ever been deeper and more understanding students of Shakespeare than these, and it is impossible that any poet of real stature who comes after them should not see Shakespeare largely through their eyes, and approach him by the road which their genius opened. The poet who follows them has no choice. He must realize that there is a profounder truth in Shakespeare than is contained in any philosophy, and that the poet becomes a truly philosophical poet not by taking philosophy for his subject matter or his inspiration, but by becoming wholly that which he potentially is, a revealer of the real. To the degree to which he follows the true method of poetry, the problems of philosophy cease to exist for him. What then, to return to the first cause of these reflections, can the prospect of an intellectual reconciliation of the conceptions of time and eternity, from which Sir Henry Newbolt expects so much, offer to a poet for whom the particular is, in fact, the universal? The reconciliation will be meaningless to him, because the divorce has never taken place. The things of time, the real world truly seen, are to the poet completely significant. There is nothing higher than complete significance. The conception of an eternity, or of an eternal reality, different from the temporal, springs only from the sense of a partial or mutilated significance in the actual. It is precisely this sense, which may be natural to man, which the great poet overcomes within himself. He does not judge experience, he submits himself to it, and he finds that the reality which presented itself to his intellectual consciousness as imperfect is received in a quite different way by the totality of his being. By the impact of that seemingly imperfect reality upon him, something is created in himself which declares that it is perfect. He recognizes the inevitability and beauty of his own painful experience, and with the same act of recognition bows himself to the inevitability and beauty of the things that are. Time is not to him a discordant and corrupting element. It is but a word for an aspect of the secret force of life itself, for the effective Godhead, which, as Goethe said, is effective in the living and not in the dead. Time is but the intellectual abstraction of that reality which he knows immediately in himself as life, the pulse of his being. To shrink from time is to shrink from life itself. That is not to say that poets have not given voice to the anguish of the temporal. Many have, nor that the poets who have done so are not poets. The contention is that, insofar as they remain in that predicament, they are incomplete and partial poets, who, through some defect of power, cannot make their rightful inheritance their own. The sense of exile is not the mark of major, but of minor poetry. Its persistence betokens a failure in poetic energy, an impotence to realize, or to be loyal to, the poetic nature. It is true that the note is recurrent in much of the poetry that is most generally admired, but that is because this emotion of exile is itself the most widespread in human hearts. The poetry of dream, in ages such as ours at least, finds a more ready response than the poetry of reality. But a growing nature quickly tires of it. It has no substance. It cannot give a final satisfaction. And to suppose it will gain substance by embracing a recondite philosophical notion of the ultimate convergence of time and eternity is an illusion. The anguish of the temporal will not be assuaged either in the poet who feels and communicates it, or the readers who respond to it, by any shadowy promise that in the dim and distant future men will feel it no more. The demand which the human soul makes is for satisfaction here and now. Men's eyes must see their salvation. It is this visible salvation that great poetry does offer. It faces the real. It extenuates nothing, shrinks from nothing. It gives us life, as it is. And we discover that we can desire nothing more perfect, for we can conceive nothing more perfect to desire. That seems miracle enough, yet that alone will not suffice, for when the influence of the great poet's alchemy has passed from us, a question remains. If that which is possesses this perfection, then why struggle to achieve a better condition? This doubt often eats at the hearts of those religious souls who are in some degree responsive to the achievements of great poetry. It is the cause of that frequent revulsion in those who ponder the idea rather than experience the attitude of mind, which often is called pantheism. The great poet, no doubt, is a pantheist, but he is primarily a poet. The pantheism, which held as an intellectual creed might engender a stoic resignation, is, as a poetic reality, a thing of potency, a sursum corda. For the poet's revelation of the perfection of what is kindles in our souls the desire to be able, with unaided vision, to see the perfection for ourselves. That is not easy. It calls for long and unrelenting effort, and for the power to accomplish in ourselves as much as in us lies of that patient submission to experience which the poet himself has practiced. We, at any rate, in order to behold the changeless beauty of the changing world, must ourselves be changed.